key issues that Marius had mentioned, and especially we talk about employment equity, and it reminds me, he mentioned his daughter, it reminds me about my daughter, and I think everyone has this dream as the leader in the organization, as the person in HR, to make sure that you live up to those expectations and reach those goals. And those dreams are fundamental, they're important. And I think, the one day I was sitting with my daughter and we were listening to the speech of Martin Luther King, "I have a dream." And my daughter was very taken and moved. And she's only 10 years old, so very moved by this speech. And, so we started talking about it, and I said, Kiora, you must always follow your dream and look hard at trying to achieve that dream. You got to get up and go for it. Try and achieve that dream of yours. So we're talking. And a few days later, I get a phone call, a little one, on Twitter, she's as well, Marius is by the way, so she gives me this call and says, "Dada, I've been thinking about this thing." And I find myself in a bit of a paradox, immediately I'm like, paradox. Okay. She said, "So you've been talking about this dream." She says, "Well, the challenge I have is that I have this amazing dream. And every time when I sleep, I get to a point where the dream is not quite finished yet. And then I have to wake up. Now I don't want to start working on it, because the challenge is I might not get to what I want to go, because I want to see what this dream actually is all about." So the result is, and this is the paradox I find myself in, that I have to sleep more in order to understand the dream. So, to all of you as leaders, as champions in your industry, I say, adopt the philosophy of my daughter and sleep in order to achieve the dream. And I guess what? It will probably never happen. So, you know the answer to that. Just a quick note as well, that all the speakers, please, if in your program that you have been provided within that give back of yours, all the speakers are in there with their bios, as well as their profile, and also a little bit of a profile in terms of the breakaway session, just a previous context in terms of what that will all be all about. Our next speaker, I'm very proud to welcome on stage the Chief Director of Diversity Management of the Department of Public Service and Administration, to give us a view in terms of the public services perspective on diversity. But what we have in common, myself and this lovely, good-looking, beautiful lady, is that her son also is in love with, I think, the sport that gave me so much, rugby. So rugby, in essence, to those of you that don't know yet, I don't want to go into it too much now because we'll find in the end is, I'm a former South African rugby player, and I played for what I firmly believe is the greatest team in the world, the Golden Lions. I know a lot of people won't agree with me on that one, but also for South Africa. And I was, when we talked about this morning's conference, which is to celebrate our diversity, I was very encouraged to come, because there was no celebration after this last weekend's match. And I'm not sure how many of you have watched South Africa against the All Blacks. It was a total disappointment, and if we can get that referee to perhaps come and referee when we play in Joburg on the 5th of October, I'd be sure that there'd be about 40,000 people who want to explain to him exactly how a game is supposed to be refereed. But Barbara Watson, please on stage, join me on stage. Barbara Watson has actually watched the game with her son. So Barbara, please come on stage. It's all yours. Thank you so much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Just for me to know how to pitch my talk, how many of you are in the private sector? If you can just raise your hands, please. Oh, great. So most of you are from the private sector. You saw the quotation from Nelson Mandela. How many of you use this book every day next to your HR manual? The South African Constitution? How many of you have got this on your desks? That quotation is the preamble in this little book. I urge you to please get this book. The Employment Equity Act is an act that is trying to translate that sentence when he says, united in our diversity. So we in the public service have to translate every little sentence in this book into a policy or a program. I didn't prepare a slide presentation like others did, because I felt that if I did that, I might be tempted to talk about statistics, as we so often do when we talk about diversity as if it's synonymous to equity. And when we talk about equity, we think it is all about quotas, when in fact, there's a very important section of the Employment Equity Act which addresses what I call substantive equality. And when we have to address that substantive equality, we shift to the quotas, and then we start talking about, do we use national demographics or do we use regional demographics? Forgetting that at the end of the day, it is not about changing the complexion of the workforce. It is about making sure that this new South Africa delivers a better life for all of us. So, you will not be seeing slides, but my speech or conversation with you will be available through Laura if you want to read it a little later. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the organizers for inviting me, because, you know, sometimes we in the public service often feel that people do not think that we have something to share, we don't deliver services adequately, and people are unhappy, we are not so good at our work, we lack capacity. So it was a great pleasure for me to be asked to come and share, because I really do believe when it comes to issues of human rights, issues of diversity, government can in fact share with the private sector, and maybe even get the private sector to look at how we do things. So I'm going to be talking primarily on the principles that underpin diversity management, because you can have the best policies, you can have the best frameworks, but if the principles are not understood, if we do not accept that diversity management is about equality, diversity management is about human rights, then we are going to keep running around figures and never getting to a point where all of us feel appreciated. In any workplace, there is a manifestation of all kinds of differences, some of which are obvious to see, some not so obvious. These differences could relate to your education, your marital status, your age, your sex, your religion, but it isn't just the differences. These differences also influence the way we behave, the way we act, the way we problem solve, and the way we react to things. And because of that, we tend to see people as in-group members and out-group members. And this absolute way of seeing things often give rise to stereotypes. Stereotypes of racism, sexism, ageism. And these stereotypes, the bad part of it is that they are always coupled with some form of discrimination in the workplace. If I'm part of this in-group, I will automatically have views about the out-group, and I may just have a tendency to discriminate against the out-group. And we know, of course, that once there is discrimination, the morale of the workforce is affected, the productivity is affected, and of course, as HR practitioners, you will know that you will then have staff turnover, and staff turnover is not good for any company or institution. Diversity management, on the other hand, informs us and assists us in harnessing these differences in a way that it contributes positively to the goals of an organization or a department. So for us in the public service, we needed to have a big paradigm shift in the way we do business. And I'm of the view that even for you in the private sector, you cannot implement diversity management programs without changing the way we look at things. This process for us in the public service determines how we include people or make sure that even if we have to use the law, we would bring some kind of diverse workforce. Diverse people have different talents, different perspectives, and when you have this diversity, these many differences, this is where innovation begins to manifest itself and show itself up. Generally, what we have found in the public service is that the presence of these differences are not normally the issue. The issue is often what we do with these differences. If we embrace them, we will succeed in achieving our goals. But if we treat them with suspicion and devalue them, we are likely to have problems. In departments where there are diverse workforce and programs that manage this process, we have actually been told by officials that our whole outlook to work has changed. And in fact, our department or a particular component in the department is actually a very happy place. Valuing diversity is not a denial of people's differences, but it is rather embracing these differences and recognizing that each of this different piece is an integral part of the whole that must be equally valued because it has something valuable to contribute. Why is diversity management important to us? I've heard that in the private sector, diversity management is often regarded as a strategic method of improving organizational effectiveness, or in some cases, a way of saving money and avoiding being sued for discrimination. I don't know if that is true. That's what I hear. For us, it is more than that. And I think to understand why is it more than that, I would actually like to paint a picture for you just before 1994, what the public service looked like. The top management in the public service then was largely white and predominantly male, because as you know, before 1994, if there was something common amongst women in South Africa, regardless of race, was the manner in which we were discriminated against. Black officials who were there in any form of senior position would have been men. And as for women and people with disabilities, they actually didn't factor as part of the leadership of the public service. This is the public service that we inherited. To some extent, you can say it was not reflective of the demographics of South Africa if it was mainly white and male, because we are the country that has 52% of its population as women. Therefore, women should have been in leadership position. We are also a country that has a high percentage of people with disabilities. And in terms of disability, government then regarded disability as a medical problem. If medicine couldn't solve the problem, you were ordered out of a position. So there was very little talk about people with disability. If you aspired to be a public official, you had a disability, forget it. If you were blind, you'd be lucky to be at the switchboard, and that is how far it went. So this is the picture that we got. Fast forward to 1994. We are now a constitutional democracy. The Constitution tells you how the country should be run and what kind of values should this country aspire to. And in the Constitution, Chapter 10, Section 195(1)(j) clearly instructs on the values and the principles for the public service. And it says, public administration must be broadly representative of the people of South Africa, with employment and personnel management practices based on ability, objectivity, fairness, and need to redress the imbalances of the past to achieve broad representation. Now, these are some of the statements that inform all these many laws which people in the private sector sometimes think, oh, this government, and there are many rules. Employment equity is one such act. Broad-based black economic employment, these are such acts. To ensure that there was in fact diversity in the public service and in the workplace, the Employment Equity Act was promulgated. For us in the public service, we then had the white paper on the transformation of the public service, as well as the white paper on affirmative action. All of these frameworks and policies essentially said, you shall now have a workforce that is reflective of the demography of South Africa. In other words, everybody must be there. In the public service, of course, we have to set an example by complying with these acts. And then we had cabinets making certain decisions where you, for example, don't necessarily have quotas. In the public service, we do have that in senior management, you must have 50% of that workforce consisting of women, and 2% of the entire workforce must consist of people with disability. Over and above these policies and frameworks, our government has ratified various United Nations conventions that speak to issues of disabilities, issues of gender equality, issues of equality for young people. Because we are a young country, such conventions are very key to us. So when we do look at our HR practices, it isn't just these policies, it is all these conventions as well. And we have to report periodically to Parliament. We have to report periodically to the Portfolio Committee. I'm sure some of you have a good laugh at us when we're looking very nervous and being challenged by the Portfolio Committees. And we also have to report to the nation. After all, we run government with your tax money. So for us, in the public service, diversity management isn't just about the bottom line. it isn't just about business. Yes, it is also about organizational effectiveness, because we want an effective and efficient public service so that you as citizens are satisfied. Currently, in the public service, women at SMS level form about 38% of the required 50%. In other words, you know, we have the 4 top levels. You're a director, chief director, deputy director general, and then the top person is the man. What we are finding though, and we have been discussing this with Cabinet, this is my responsibility, to report to Cabinet and to Parliament how government is performing in this regard. And we did a little research and found that a kind of malicious compliance is creeping in, where women are located largely at entry level. That's the director level. So a particular department can maliciously comply and say we have 40–50% of women at our senior level. But when you look at it, chief directors are less. And of course, as you go to the apex, the DDGs and the DGs are mainly men. And this is a practice that is concerning us, and we have asked Cabinet to note it. In December, I'll be reporting on it, on whether it has improved or not. Doesn't look like it's going to be improved very much, but we will find a way to deal with it. How do we do it in the public service? We recognize that as a country, we have a history that did not value diversity. And I'm telling you, even in the private sector, you can come up with your best policy. If you do not function on the premise that you come from a background that does not value diversity, diversity management is not going to succeed in your business. In the public service, I'm located in the Human Resource Management and Development branch. This is the branch that develops human resource policies and programs that apply public service-wide. But I'm sure you've seen from my biography that I'm not an HR specialist. So in the public service, there's a recognition that some of these issues of transformation are rights-based. They are about human rights. Being an HR specialist does not automatically make you a human rights specialist. You are expected to implement policies that are there to enhance and promote the rights of people who in many instances were previously marginalized and disadvantaged. If you do not empower yourself and go for capacity building on issues of human rights, you will not succeed in your work. So, if anything today that you can learn from me, please go and study the Constitution. Please go and read the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. If you can just read these 2 documents, their principles, at least you will be able to say, as an HR practitioner, you understand why you have to make sure that diversity is well managed. We have developed different programs. For women, for example, we have developed a gender equality strategic framework, which is very much like the framework that was presented to you. It has the principles and a step-by-step guide on how do you create an enabling environment that will make sure that you attract women. Having attracted them, you retain them. And to retain them, you have to develop them and not create a glass ceiling for the women. You do not have policies and rules that suddenly big meetings when you network and you brainstorm, you have them at 4 o'clock. When in your staff you have women of childbearing age who want to work but still want to be women and mothers. So you exclude them, and then you say, oh, these women just want high positions, but they're not prepared to work till late. And if they work till late, when they get home, their husbands have long faces, and you begin to interfere with the work-life balance. So you see, some of these issues of diversity are structural. Your policies, the way you do business, have got everything to do with diversity management. And the same goes for people with disability. We know that as an emerging democracy, our public transport system is dreadful. And because of that, if I have a disability, I use calipers or I'm on a wheelchair, I can thump a taxi as much as I want. It's not going to stop for me, because I waste too much time getting out of my wheelchair, finding somebody to help me, and yet you expect that person to be at work at 8 o'clock like everybody else. Why can't you reasonably accommodate them and say, you can start at 9 o'clock, because after 9, the taxi driver will wait for that person, because the taxi driver wants to pull the taxi. So these are some of the issues. They are not necessarily internal, they are also external, that informs how we manage diversity in our workplace. So we have programs such as what we call the HOD's 8 principles. These principles are largely formulated around key issues that makes the workplace responsive to the needs of women. It looks at policy matters. For example, do you mainstream gender in your policy? Let's say a travel policy, for example. If you have a young woman who has a child, maybe breastfeeding, and has to travel, do you make provision for that child to travel with or the child minor? If a woman is highly expectant and is not a manager, and they have to travel and fly, do you have variations in your policy, for example, that that woman can travel business class instead of economy, just for the period while she is expectant? Because pregnancy, it's part of the package. If you value that woman and you value the talent she brings in the department, you will do that. And I think the same goes for disability. Do you have a policy on reasonable accommodation? A policy that says that if you have an employee on a wheelchair, and because if you are on a wheelchair very often, your body mass increases more than anybody else out of inactivity, to make them comfortable, they travel in business class, and you, the manager, sit in economy class. You know, do you have those kinds of things? And for us in the public service, diversity management isn't just about the quotas. It's enabling people to access equally, like you and I. We also have the Job Access Strategic Framework, which integrates the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, that will help you to develop a plan for your department. If an employee was blind, for example, and had a guide dog, how do you make provision for that guide dog? Because that guide dog isn't just the dog, it is the eyes of that particular employee. Do you make provision for an employee who is deaf in terms of employment of certain staff members? Do you have one staff member that is a sign language interpreter, so that when that employee goes to a meeting, he or she is able to participate? So all these frameworks and policies provide step-by-step guidelines that you can use to really make your department or your business an employer of choice, and people will be willing to apply for positions there. I'm not going to bore you with all the frameworks that we have, but you will see them in the presentation. Now, what happens if you fail to manage diversity in the workplace? The commonest one, of course, is that people will leave. And as HR practitioners, you know what a costly business it is to replace an employee. The second one is that because our labor is highly regulated, you're going to be sitting with a lot of labor disputes. And you'll be spending lots of time managing conflict, and sometimes this impacts on the morale of the staff, and there's low productivity. People get to know, especially for us in the public service, people know very soon that, you know what, that particular department is not the best place for a woman who wants to get somewhere. Or if you're a person with disability, if you get a job there, upward mobility, just stay for as long as is possible, but start looking for another job. So you see this musical chairs, you know, and in the public service it's easy to see it. When I do the analysis of statistics of women, young people, people with disability, you actually see that one semester Department X was meeting targets, and the next one, that target has shifted to that department, this one has declined. And if you follow up, you ask the women, why did you leave? They will tell you very often, it relates to an environment that is not enabling them. There's nothing wrong in women wanting it all. They also want to be successful, they want to be top dogs, but at the same time they also want to be mothers, they want to be wives, you know. So we must make that space for everybody. So you know that our business is not secret in the public service. You read about it all the time. You know the lots of money that government spends on litigation. People suing government for unfair labor practice, and people saying that, you know, I have a disability. When I went for an interview, the interviewing panel had nobody who had a disability, or nobody that was a woman. It was all men. And therefore, I'm contesting that I didn't get that job because you discriminated against me. And the settlement often involves a lot of money. So I'm sure in the private sector you have the same thing. It's just that we don't read that much about it. Journalists don't like talking about you. Maybe you do something for them. They like talking about us. But most importantly, if you value diversity, it means that you have lost somebody who, known or unbeknown to you, could have actually contributed significantly to the growth of your organization. We look at diversity management throughout the whole process in the way we advertise. We are now insisting to departments that have not met equity targets, we are saying to them, you must now, if you're short of women at SMS, we expect your adverts to be very explicit and say that these posts at senior management level are best suited for women. They use their different wording, but you must be very explicit that the main people you're targeting are women. And for disability, you must also be very explicit. I don't know, some of you may have seen that about a month ago, the Department of Home Affairs advertised over 50 positions countrywide, from chief director level. Now, if you're a chief director, you're third in line, so it's a very senior position. So from chief director all the way to the lowest post, all of them earmarked for people with disability only. And this is a big, big step, and yes. And you know, Department of Home Affairs a few years ago was a laughing stock. But when you look at Department of Home Affairs now, the turnaround is not just in terms of its efficiency, but it is also in terms of how it manages processes such as diversity management. So it's becoming better than SARS, for that matter. So in terms of how you advertise, you clearly target the groups that are not represented, and you indicate very clearly that we want you. And when people come in, if it's people with disability, when you invite them for an interview, you would ask them, how would you like to be reasonably accommodated? Because on the form, they have to indicate if they have a disability. You don't just assume that, oh, they are going to need a ramp, only to find that they don't need a ramp, they have calipers, you know. So all these kinds of things. And then once they are in the system, you also make sure that your capacity building programs are diversified to address all these different needs of the different groups. And then, of course, your managers. Our big challenge is around management, that so often people have paper qualifications, but in terms of people management, the skills, the maturity, and the ability to diversify. But because we are a youthful country, we do not want to lose young managers. And we also have old managers such as me who have our own old way of thinking. We have the Balama, as most of you might know. This is another department in our ministry that provides training for public officials. And my component, together with them, has developed a gender mainstreaming training program, for example, and we have just last year developed a disability management training. So we encourage the managers to go there and equip themselves with the skills on how to manage this diverse workshop. And we also celebrate diversity. We sort of take advantage of the corporate calendar of South Africa. If you look at March, for example, it's Human Rights Month, around Human Rights Day. So within the public service, there'll be lots of activities in different departments around issues of human rights. If it comes to June, for example, Youth Month, there'll be lots of activities, and that's where we encourage the focal persons for these different groups to do a lot of advocacy and education around those issues. And you know that just last month we had Women's Month, and then we also use that as Women's Month to do a lot of advocacy, the benefits of all of these things. And this month, of course, it's I don't know if it's serendipity or had you planned this to be in September, which is Heritage Month, because our diversity is our heritage and we need to celebrate our diversity. So So in the public service, we don't let it happen by chance, we plan for it. And I'm sure you'll read in the papers, it's not that we like events, it's not that we like parties and free food. Underlying the party are messages. Maybe you don't read the messages, you just look at our party. But all of these events often have messages that are advocating for the rights of these diverse workforces. So I think I have reached the end of my time, but essentially the foundation of diversity management in the public service is a human rights approach. But because we have legislation that enforces that numerical change through the Employment Equity Act, we have to develop all sorts of other programs that help us to manage this diverse workshop. I hope that this sharing has helped you maybe to begin to understand why are we always having these big things about women, about youth, about heritage. They all form part and parcel of valuing diversity and helping people to see that we all have something to contribute. It isn't just a legal requirement, but it's a human rights issue for us. Thank you very much.